Welcome to Out of Home Insider, the loudest voice in out of home. Today's guest is Brooke Ermogenis. Brooke is the founder of DOOHx, the first of its kind academy for marketers who want to learn all about how programmatic digital out of home really works. Brooke takes us under the hood and behind the scenes of what a decade on the leading edge of programmatic looks like. We talk about the global landscape and how digital out of home looks differently around the world, as well as some unique dynamics at play that we should all be paying attention to. Coming to you live from a boat. Yes, seriously, Brooke is joining us from a boat on this episode as she travels the world with her husband. This episode is full of insight, so grab a notebook. And if you'd like to learn more about the DOOHx Academy, visit DOOHx.io. Without further ado, let's go.
Welcome, everybody, to the Out of Home Insider Show, a podcast like no other, hosted by the one and only Tim Rowe. Get ready to have some knowledge dropped on you and to be entertained, because nothing's more valuable than food for your brain. So sit back, relax, we're about to dive in as the best industry podcast is about to begin.
Brooke, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Just that easy. How I think a good place to start is origin stories with, like, how'd you get into this crazy game of out of home? You're on a boat. You're in a boat off the coast of Greece right now. So we've got to get from how you got into out of home to how you're floating around in the ocean right now and talk programmatic digital out of home along the way. But thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. And gosh, how much time have you got?
I know we might have to do a two-part. So you broke into out of home how long ago?
Gosh, just over 10 years, maybe 12 years ago now. Gosh, that sounds scary, but yeah, it's been a while.
No kidding.
So
and on the buy side, sell side, yeah.
So I was on the buy side for a couple of years, and then I went over to the dark side, the light side, however you want to look at it, the sales side of things. And I continued with the publisher in Australia for a few years before I moved over to Germany, and then continued with the same publisher in Germany for their inventory across Europe. So I was heading up the sort of business development side of things for their programmatic offering. And because it's a 100% digital network, the transition was quite an easy one for us. So we got in quite early days when this whole programmatic buzzword sort of just started emerging and everyone was getting a bit excited.
Circa when? Like, what year was this?
I don't know, it's probably four years ago, something like that. So, yeah. And there was sort of talk in market. The first players were emerging on the tech side of things. So we were kind of getting into the flow as to what exactly this whole programmatic thing is and how it's going to work. So a big part of my role there was education. So we were going around to agencies, to specialists, and kind of talking them through, what is Programmatic DOOH? How does it work? What is out of home for the digital buyers that are new to sort of the whole industry? And why should you care? Why should you be getting on board? But it became pretty apparent very quickly that, sort of 1 hour workshops with people wasn't really moving the needle at all in terms of education. And there really weren't any centralized sort of resources out there for programmatic DOOH or for out of home in general, which still kind of boggles my mind, being such a big growth industry that there's not these sort of centralized agnostic resources in place. So that's how sort of DOOHx came to be, that I decided that it was about time someone put pen to paper and made these sort of educational resources accessible to anyone, anywhere, especially as the industry is kind of growing now, because there's so many more buyers from the digital side of things that are coming into out of home, and obviously out of home itself is evolving. So it just seemed like a right place, right time kind of thing to kind of get this education out there in the world. And the boat, it's a longer story.
Let's hold the boat. It makes sense that an hour wouldn't be enough, and we I've seen some of the same challenges. I was doing a webinar a couple of years ago, and just on really fundamental kind of things. And there's a huge education gap for the industry at large, and especially programmatic digital out of home, because I know that folks have been anxiously awaiting just a final definitive answer. There's interpretations. How do you define, what is programmatic digital out of home once and for all here today? Out of home insider Brooke from a boat. What is programmatic out of home?
So, I mean, on a very, very fundamental level, it's the automated trading of inventory via these programmatic channels. That's really it. It's a new way of trading. So it's really catching up out of home to the rest of the world that's already been doing this for quite some time. It's evolving all the methodologies and the processes that we use to make it more automated and intelligent and integrate more data and integrate as well with other mediums as well more closely. So I think people still kind of think about programmatic DOOH and say like, oh, it's great for doing, weather triggers and, all these sort of quote unquote fancy things. And it's so much more than that. It's like programmatic DOOH, as I was saying to you the other day, like this is out of home's print moment where it went from like offline, very manual, old school way of doing things to more or less overnight becoming a whole new digital medium. And that's really what this is bringing to the table for out of home. Like it's evolving everything about how we plan, how we trade, how we use the medium, how other people use the medium. And it's making the inventory so much more accessible than it ever was before to people, both inside, out of home industry, but also everybody else. And you can see that the interest is just sort of exploding everywhere. So it's an entire evolution of the way that out of home is bought and sold. And it's going to, it's going to change how everything's traded moving forward.
How do you think about, there's multiple DSPs and some have some of the inventory and others have some of it. And sometimes there's an overlap. As a marketer, how do you start to make decisions around, if someone's listening to this and thinking, I want to add a trade desk to my agency, or I'm a marketer and maybe programmatic digital out of home is something that I want to try. Where do you start? There's so many different things and there is such a lack of education. Where do you point someone to get started?
I mean, other than just the education side of things, sort of getting the basic lingo and understanding down, I think people are a bit sort of hesitant to just go through the process of trial and error. People they seem to be holding off and waiting for one perfect solution to come out before they even get involved. And because this is such a new medium and there are so many different types of tech players and publishers and things out there, the dust isn't going to settle on a final answer until everyone gives it a try and offers feedback. There needs to be a feedback loop in place. And that can't really happen until people start trying. So chances are, if you're working at one of the large agency groups, you already have DSPs that other departments are using for different types of trading. If you already have these agreements in place, then by all means go through those DSPs and just see what's there. Talk to the local publishers in your market to say, where are you available and how can I buy you? But you can at least find one that aligns more with what you're trying to achieve for your clients and with the publishers that are in your market.
Makes sense. So it doesn't need to be like a perfect, the final solution to whatever your marketing woes are. Just find a place to start and start testing, as all good marketers do. Test, Absolutely. Get some feedback, see what you like, what you don't like, give the feedback just on the literal platform itself and what you liked about it and what you didn't like, what you'd like to see. I think that's a super critical step for the publishers who maybe have digital inventory. Maybe I'm a static owner that's adding some digital inventory to my mix, or maybe I'm just all digital. I've sat in sales meetings where leadership was debating about, should I be on this DSP or this DSP? And I was kind of sitting there as like the internet guy. I'm like, all of them, because it's all found money, but maybe that's the right answer. Maybe it's not, depending on your circumstances. As a publisher, what should a publisher be considering when thinking about connecting their inventory to programmatic?
And see, this is the same point that I always face, is that, from a publisher side of things, it's the more the merrier, because the more visibility that you have with SSPs, the more DSPs you're then connected to, and so on and so on. So there are lots of SSPs that are sort of stronger in different markets or that have different integrations with DSPs. So while it can be quite time consuming in terms of the actual integration process, for me, it's a no-brainer for any publisher to connect to as many SSPs as you possibly can, because ultimately it means that your inventory is in more shop windows around the world. You know what I mean? So the more the merrier.
Right. And if it's not available, if it's not available, that it's not going to get sold, but you might as well have it. Like you said, I love that. I love that analogy, in the store window, so people know, hey, I could buy this.
Exactly. And the integrations, like different SSPs might have integrations with the same DSPs, but there might be different types of integration. So one might have a full integration, which makes it nice and easy to run a campaign, and one might have like a third-party one that goes through another player. So, being able to have that flexibility with your clients as well, to say, like, yes, we can do it with this DSP, and if we do it through this SSP on our end, then it's going to be a much smoother process. So having the DSPs is one thing, but the actual integrations with those DSPs is another thing. So like I said, the more the merrier, because it gives you so many more options.
I love that. And thinking about, so now we've kind of bridged the gap of connecting supply with demand fundamentally, coming back to those marketers who are testing programmatic for the first time. How would you recommend that they test it? Large format? Should you buy the types of inventory that maybe you're familiar and comfortable with? Obviously, creative becomes a consideration with different sizes, different screens, different context. Where do you suggest getting started? Okay, I'm convinced now. I want to test programmatic digital out of home. What should I be thinking about for that first test?
Yeah, so I mean, my advice, especially to out-of-home specialists that have sort of been planning out of home for a long time, start with the kind of campaign that you're familiar with, something that you've done before for clients. Maybe they've got a standing sort of branding campaign they do each year, or whatever it might be. Like, keep it simple at first and just try to activate exactly what you've done before, but through programmatic channels. Because then you don't have to stress so much about, what formats am I using, where's my audience at, and all that sort of thing. You can really focus on the fundamentals of, how do I set this up in this platform? How do I track the progress? How can I monitor what's going on? So you can really, draw a comparison between what you've done before and how it's going to look now that programmatic's kind of come into play. Because it's going to change so many different processes and procedures that are involved with planning. So starting with something that you're familiar with that's sort of, let's say low risk, it can really help you kind of justify it all in your head and line it up with how it's going to work in the programmatic sense.
Makes sense. And you made a joke earlier about the weather triggers and how much there's so much more we can do with programmatic. For folks listening that don't know what weather triggers are or dynamic creative, I think maybe we can lay some groundwork there and move from there to what the real possibilities are. I've got my coffee, and we were talking here in the lead up that it's 18 degrees here in New Jersey, and I'm wearing shorts and flip flops. There might be a dynamic trigger out there somewhere on a billboard around here today saying, "Hey, it's cold. Go get a coffee." But talk about what some of those triggers are that folks don't even know exist, but will get excited about. And then what the real possibilities are that get you excited about programmatic at home.
Yeah. So, I mean, the sort of targeting triggers we're talking about are things like, weather and pollen counts and things that basically draw on data feeds to activate a campaign. So we would have seen it was a few years ago, there was one with a British Airways flight where the kid was pointing to the sky as it went over, that sort of thing. The programmatic side of things makes that so much easier because it's so much more easy to integrate these sort of data feeds into these platforms, into these creatives. And many of the DSP platforms out there have these data feeds that you can just integrate. So say, I want to do this when it's raining and over 20 degrees, check a box and it will just do it for you. Whereas previously out of home, this took weeks or months of coding and cost an arm and a leg to do for a single campaign. So on that side of things, it makes it just much easier to do what we've already been doing before. But I think if you combine the creative with the sort of non-guaranteed nature of programmatic digital out of home, it really allows you to get really flexible with making your campaign much more contextually relevant, as well as integrating these sort of triggers. So there was an example of a coffee chain or something that was in a train station. And, you can say, you've got 5 minutes to your next train, why not stop in for a coffee? And you can even monitor, how busy it is in the coffee chain to see if they can get that coffee in 5 minutes, you know what I mean? But then once there's only 2 minutes to your train, there's no point in showing the ad because they haven't got time to stop the coffee, you know what I mean? So previously you would be paying for all of these impressions that you wouldn't be using for the half the time it being relevant and half the time it just being fully irrelevant because no one's going to stop and, see what's going on. So you can get much more clever with your creative and you can actually make it much more cost efficient by adding these sort of triggers in. But I think what's even more exciting than that is that you're not just targeting audiences, but you can target the behavior of those audiences and how that behavior changes based on these kind of triggers. So if you're trying to target, cyclists who cycle to work every day, maybe you get some street furniture and billboards along the road that they can see on their way to work. But if it's raining, they're not going to be riding their bike to work. You know what I mean? Their behavior is going to change. So chances are they're either going to get on the train or they're going to drive. So then based on how that behavior would change, you can then trigger your campaign to follow that audience where they go based on the behavior changes that happen because of these triggers. You know what I mean? So it's not just about displaying an ad for an umbrella when it's raining. We can actually go so much further beyond this point, but it takes, some planning consideration, like setting it up properly. But I think we're going to see a lot more interesting out-of-home campaigns, and they're going to be much more cost efficient at the end of the day as well, because you're getting actually what you need out of it rather than paying for waste impressions.
I've never heard anyone talk about the non-guaranteed nature of programmatic and the ability to be dynamic as a way to hedge against the non-guaranteed nature of programmatic. Like that's brilliant. It's to minimize waste. And it's just completely like reshaping the way that I've thought about programmatic, and hopefully for a lot of folks listening to this too. Maybe talk about that for a second, the non-guaranteed nature. I think sometimes folks don't fully grasp what that means, right? Hey, I'm bidding and I'm, I know that this billboard's in my campaign. Why am I not seeing my ad? What, I'm standing here, I've stood here for an hour, I haven't seen it. Is this thing even working? What does that mean, non-guaranteed?
So it's such a departure from how out-of-home was always planned and bought before, because previously you couldn't even buy, screens and things in much more sort of smaller bite chunks than a week or 2 weeks or 4 weeks, depending on the format. So it was previously bought in packages and usually multiple screens at once, and it ran for the 4 weeks and then it was taken down and that was it. So there wasn't so much of this kind of clever targeting and triggers and on when you need it and off when you don't kind of thing, because it wasn't possible, or you would charge quite a big premium for it. So really all the non-guaranteed means is that you have the flexibility to bid for what you want when you want it, and not pay when you don't need to be live. So there's not so much, at least at the moment, there's not so much demand for the out-of-home formats programmatically that you're not going to get the inventory that you want. It's not really about, am I going to get it, am I not? It's really about giving you the flexibility to not pre-commit to being locked in for a certain amount of time, so that you can be active when and where you want, and in clever ways like we were talking about with the creatives. So really it just comes down to flexibility and the ability to dial up, dial down. You can switch between publishers, you can switch between formats, you can, it just gives you so much more flexibility on the planning side of things. And, when you have existing relationships with publishers, chances are you can get the impressions that you want anyway by just saying, hey, make sure that there's some impressions available, or tell me what your avails are. So the availability side of things can still be managed with non-guaranteed activity. But what it really provides buyers is that flexibility to create the campaign that they actually want, as opposed to being locked in to a preconceived sort of notion of what it should be.
What are your thoughts on that with impressions versus like the number of plays? Do you have an opinion? That freaks me out a little bit with estimated impressions, or like, estimated impressions that were based off of like, I think this is it. Not even like an established currency. And any best practices around impressions versus plays, or just how to factor that all in?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different conversations to be had around this. It's like, should out of home really be basing its value on the one currency that's ultimately unquantifiable in out of home? That's like a whole nother conversation to be having.
Yeah, that's part two.
Because we're trying to sort of fit into this mold of impression-based buying, but of course audience measurement out of home is notoriously impossible to standardize. I mean, ultimately it is. So there's certainly a conversation to be had whether the merits of pay per play, which at least can be sort of thoroughly reported on, versus impressions should be had. But as a publisher, I think the best thing that you can do is educate on what impressions mean on your network. Because if someone says, I want to buy 1 million impressions for 2 weeks across, every screen in New York City, like that's fine. But depending on the number of screens there are and the audience numbers, that could mean that your ad's only going to play like once every 3 days on every third screen or something. You know what I mean?
Sure,
so it's like, what do impressions actually mean on your network, and how can they sort of rationalize it in their minds? So how we used to approach it was we'd sort of give like a light, medium and heavy estimation of availability. So a medium would be like a normal weight campaign, so once in a loop basically, and the equivalent of what that looks like in impressions. And then a light would be every second loop, and then a heavy one would be a double looped one. Not that programmatic digital out of home is bought that way, and it shouldn't be, but it at least gives them a way to sort of align it in their minds as to what the impressions actually mean. Because while every publisher might have a different metric or whatever to methodology to making up these numbers, at least you can sort of understand what exactly that means for what you're buying, so that you don't end up getting one play every 3 days or 10 plays a minute when you don't want it. You know what I mean?
Right. Establish some sort of relative basis so that I can associate it with. Do you think is programmatic by itself its own strategy? Should programmatic be considered as a complement to a campaign at large? Do you have a best practice around that, or thoughts around should it be its own standalone or part of a campaign?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, the majority of inventory in out of home is, and probably will be for a long time, static. So there's no way of saying that programmatic is the only answer ever, because there's so much inventory out there that you still need to buy that's not digital. Having said that, though, I think that all digital out-of-home advertising will be bought programmatically eventually, but this really comes down to how quickly publishers can either digitize or programmatically enable their inventory. It's really just about making it accessible. So the more DSPs, the more SSPs, the more publishers that are involved, the closer we'll get to this sort of happy medium where we can do digital out-of-home programmatically. Because it just makes more sense. I mean, not just from the planning perspective, but also like the back-end side of things. From a resource perspective, it cuts out so much time and energy and the need for so many different resources if you're planning it through programmatic means, because so much of what you had to do before is already taken care of through these platforms. It makes it so much more straightforward, so much easier. And you were saying before about the creatives and the different sizes and things. Once people sort of wrap their heads around HTML5 and how it works, we can start making creatives that will automatically adapt to different sizes. So you don't have to have a creative agency sitting there making, 30 different sizes of whatever. Yeah. Like everything will become more streamlined. So ultimately, to me, it makes more sense in every way to do it programmatically if you can. But we have a little bit of a way to go before it's all sort of centralized enough for that to happen.
And are these net new dollars to out of home? Are these traditional dollars shifting to programmatic? I remember sitting in those sales meetings, and they're senior account executives with big books of business concerned that, hey, my $500,000 hospital client, I don't want them to go start spending this money programmatically with me. I want to still be able to control those direct relationships. How does that all work with programmatic?
I mean, from my experience on the publisher side and from what we've seen, I would say 95% of the revenue was incremental. So from incremental sources completely. We didn't see, I know that this is a big fear of people, that it's just going to shift from traditional to programmatic and we're just like kind of dealing with the same money rinsed a different way kind of thing. But as I was saying to you the other day, like the majority of interest that we're seeing in programmatic DOOH at the moment is not from within the out-of-home industry. It's everyone else getting excited about it. It's
the digital agencies.
Exactly. And, there's more and more marketers looking for a way to sort of get around the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. And they're seeing this new medium coming up that they can buy. And that's where so much of the interest is coming from. And I think they're much more sort of freer with test budgets and things to put into it to see how it works, if it improves things and that sort of thing. So I think, the majority of interest is coming from outside. So I haven't seen, at least from my experience, I haven't seen that it's money just shifting from one place to the other. It's all been incremental, and not just incremental from your local market, but incremental from international markets as well. Because what people kind of forget that is, even if you just have a publisher network in, say, the UK, once you're connected to these SSPs and DSPs, which are global, someone from an agency in China can buy your inventory tomorrow, and chances are you've never spoken to them before. They've never heard of you. But because you're on these platforms, you're visible. Like I said, the storefronts, that you're out there for people to find. So, I mean, the incremental opportunity far outweighs any discussion that needs to be had around traditional versus programmatic money, in my opinion.
Well, there it is. We put that to bed. We put that to bed once and for all. I totally agree. And folks forget that before you could buy Google ads programmatically without talking about it in an automated fashion, pay-per-click ads were sold direct, right? Like there were salespeople at Google who went out and sold paid ads. And it was just one crazy test that an engineer wanted to run of, hey, what if we put this on an automated bidding platform? And what Google found was that they drove rate up 60%. They commanded a 60% premium by creating a market to establish an efficient rate, right? Which is a bid system, because people are willing to tell you what they're willing to pay. Exactly. So I think it's very exciting. And we're kind of like very early stage. This is like 2007, 2008 on the internet, folks. I think need to buckle up for a rocket ship ride. They've got to learn about this stuff too, though, so that when we get to the moon, so that we can fly the rocket to the moon, but so that when we get to the moon, we know how to set up, everything that we need to set up. And you've done just an amazing job. You've built out the foremost academy on programmatic digital out of home. Talk to us about that and how folks can learn more from your academy.
Yeah, so the idea with DOOHx, as I was saying before, was to create sort of a centralized educational resource that was accessible to anyone, anywhere. And the point of the education, or the little that there was sort of in the market at the time, is that it was all from a perspective of whoever was talking about it. There was no sort of third-party information available. It was all like, based on what the capabilities of my network are, here's what you can do with Programmatic DOOH, and so on. And rightfully so, they're pitching their own products, but there was really no sort of agnostic fundamentals out there that could just say, this is what the technology is, this is how it can work, and these are the possibilities that you have. So the idea with DOOHx was that we started with the 2 101 courses, so the foundational courses. One is PDO 101, so one for more than, or people already have a background in out of home that sort of understand the formats and the industry and how it works, but are new to the sort of programmatic trading side of things. And even those from programmatic that are unfamiliar with how it works in out of home, because there are quite a few nuances to it. So that covers everything, what is it, how does it work, who are the players, what are the benefits, what are the challenges, and that sort of thing. And then we have Digital Out of Home 101 for those that aren't from the out of home industry, that really want to learn more about the formats themselves, so the different sizes and types and how they're used and how you use them for your campaign and how to fulfill campaign KPIs with different formats and that sort of thing. So the idea with those two was to really lay the foundations for everybody on both sides of the equation. Get them certified, get as much base knowledge out there as possible. And then come the end of April, we're going to be releasing the PDO Advanced course, where we're going to sort of dive a little bit deeper beyond just sort of terminology and definitions, and start having the kind of conversations about how it's going to sort of be shaped for the future. Because ultimately, it's not all set in stone yet. The dust certainly hasn't settled on any of this just yet, and it won't for quite some time. So the advanced course is really kind of about igniting ideas and conversations in people that sort of lead us to the next phase of the sort of evolution of Programmatic DOOH.
It's exciting stuff. You're definitely on the tip of the spear right now, and we appreciate you being willing to lead that charge. If folks are listening right now and they want to learn more about that, where should they go? What's the Latin long on learning more? So www.DOOHx.io, and you can find all the information on both courses. You can sign up for the courses there. And there's a chat box in the corner. If they have any questions, they can always reach out to me and I'll get back to them as soon as I can. Perfect. We'll make sure to link to it in the show notes in the description. You got to give Brooke a chance though to get back to you, because as we mentioned in the opening, she's on a boat. You tell us about the boat. Like where in the world is Brooke? Is the new game that we're going to play. You should have a map track. We can follow along on your journey.
Could do. Yeah. Look, COVID lockdowns did weird things to all of us, okay? And sure so did. We took it to kind of the nth degree. In April last year, we bought a boat. We moved on board. We bought it in Cyprus. And we spent the next sort of 9 months sailing around the Greek islands while I'm, recording courses and educating people with those sorts of things. Bit off slightly more than I thought I could chew, but it's fine. Got there in the end. And yeah, we're just wrapping up winter in Greece now, and then in a couple of weeks when the weather gets a bit better, we'll head on to Italy and continue west for a while, I suppose, is the general plan.
You live your product out of home. Brooke lives her life out of home. It's been a lot of fun. We're going to have to do a part 2, because I know this is going to generate a lot of conversation. We're going to get some great questions. Make sure to check out the course. Where else are you active? Are you active on social? Where can folks go to follow you, learn more about you?
We're really active on LinkedIn, so you'll find the DOOHx company page and also my page. We put a lot of different content out there, and any updates on upcoming courses and things will be all listed on the LinkedIn pages.
Awesome. Easy enough. We'll make sure to link to all of that. Brooke, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. If you found this to be helpful, please share it with somebody else who could benefit. As always, make sure to smash that subscribe button or give it a follow on wherever you're listening, and we'll see y'all next time.
Quarter century, I finally came to my senses. I finally got my hand up on the tinted Benz, kid. I see the world clear through my tinted lenses. With the dream and the drive, the possibilities endless. Now print that, send this all the way to Tokyo. Take a trip down south, down to Mexico. Next stop, Shanghai, the world-class trade show. First class all the way, cause that's how we roll. Yeah, call us the rock star businessman. Rockin' shows, we handle business, man. We got our own future in the palm of our hands, cause divided